Alright, so let's see. Let's see how that light... Testing.
If I wish I had the big cheeks of Lilia, they would take up most of it.
Alright, March 14th, 2001.
Ready to start?
Yes, ready to go.
I want to dwell today on my grandparents and their way of life because my own grandchildren have no knowledge of them at all. I'll start with my paternal grandparents. My grandfather came to this country with his wife, landing at Ellis Island, and he was born in 1863. His wife was born in 1876. He was 32 years old and she was 19, and she was already 6 months pregnant when she arrived at Ellis Island. And my father was born 3 months after they arrived. He was born in New Jersey, where they settled. They had settled in Newark, New Jersey, which is, as I say, the place where my father was born. My grandfather was a most remarkable man, and I felt very close to him. The thing I remember most is his versatility in so many things, and the fact that he worked so hard. He had quite a wonderful house. It was a house that had vineyards in back, which he built himself. He had his own grapes. He had a goat, so that we had goat milk. He had a chicken coop, which was attached to a 2-car garage. He had so many amenities. He had a wonderful garden full of tomatoes and peppers and everything else. He had a regular greenhouse, which he built himself, in which he put his little plants. And most of this work he had done himself. He was an extremely solitary kind of man. That is to say, he didn't associate with almost anybody else. He never visited anybody else's house, but they visited him. Now, the house was in a neighborhood called Blaine Street, which was in the shape of a horseshoe. And there were about eight families living on that horseshoe. Our house was by far the best house. It had a 2-car garage, it had a large yard, it was surrounded by a picket fence, and it was immaculately kept by my grandfather. The other houses and the neighbors were quite interesting. There were 3 other houses of Italian immigrants. One of them wasn't very good at all. The other house was quite nice with extensive lawns and so on. Then there were 4 or 5 houses of Czechoslovakian immigrants in the neighborhood. Some of them were quite good people. Others were, let's say, they didn't work quite so hard. Our immediate neighbor was a Czechoslovakian who was an alcoholic, and he would stumble home drunk, and his wife did all the work. I'll never forget that she chopped wood constantly because she had a wood-burning stove in the kitchen, which not very many people had. And I used to visit there and watch her chop that wood and haul it in the kitchen and burn it in the stove. Our immediate next-door neighbor was of German ancestry. The man was very old, but one of his daughters taught piano. The other daughter was what we then called a corseteer, that is, a woman who sold corsets and measured for corsets. And she had a very nice shop on Main Street in the city, and as corsets disappeared and women no longer wore them, she moved on into lingerie, so it became a lingerie shop rather than a corset shop. But one of the interesting things about my grandfather was a very dignified man. He had been an officer in the Italian National Police, and I remember hanging in his parlor was a beautiful picture, a large, almost life-size picture of himself with his uniform, with golden epaulets and his sword and so on. He was quite remarkably handsome and very dignified. He wore pince-nez glasses, for example, the kind that Woodrow Wilson wore and the kind that Franklin Roosevelt wore. They were kind of in style then. The house was an interesting house. It was heated by steam, by a big steam furnace in the cellar, which was fueled by coal, and that became a great problem as they became old because they couldn't walk up and down the stairs. And I used to go as a boy every couple of days and go down the cellar and fill the coal scuttle, as we called it, with coal and bring it up so that they'd have a good supply of coal for a couple of days. I also, as I got older and couldn't take care of the yard, I went down and mowed the lawn. They never asked me to do it. I just did it. I'd mow the lawn and I'd run other errands for them. I remember the first job I had, for example, I got $15 pay for the week. And one of the first things I did was to buy a pint of vanilla ice cream and bring it to my grandmother. She loved vanilla ice cream. And by the time I got from the store, walked from the store to the house, the ice cream was just about the right consistency. It melted a little bit. And I'll never forget how she sat on the porch and ate that ice cream. She enjoyed it so.
So this was the Braibanti.
Yes, it was, yeah.
So this is your father's parents.
My father's parents. My grandmother was a typical Italian wife, I guess, because she spent all of her time in the kitchen. She had what she called rheumatism, which I suppose was what we now call arthritis, so she couldn't maneuver very well. But she was a marvelous cook. I loved her food. Anything she cooked, I loved. And occasionally she'd invite me down to have a meal with them. But as I say, she spent most of her time in the kitchen. She rarely left the house. She would not drive with my grandfather because she didn't trust his driving. He wasn't a very good driver. She'd drive with my father, however. My father and mother would take her shopping once a week, or we'd take her out for a little ride, maybe once a week, something like that. But otherwise, she remained in the kitchen. She loved opera. She had a Victrola on which she played all the operas, especially Galagucci, who was the very famous tenor at that time, and she would sing along with him. She had a beautiful voice. She was highly educated, by the way. She went to convent schools in Italy. She wrote beautifully, she read, her calligraphy was wonderful. Similarly, my grandfather was well educated. He read a good deal. Also, he was a marvelous calligrapher, and he showed me how to do calligraphy. And I'll never forget once he wrote my name in beautiful calligraphy for me to show the teacher. And I brought it in as a young boy, and I proudly showed it to the teacher. And I was so proud of that calligraphy. One of the episodes that I remember best was when I went to the grocery store with a $50 piece to buy something for my mother. The grocer gave me change for a quarter instead of for a $50. When my grandfather found out about that, he took me by the hand. We walked to the store together. He went to the grocer. He faced up to the grocer and he said in a very stern voice, "My grandson said he gave you a $50. You have to believe him. He gave you a $50." And the grocer was embarrassed. He gave me the right change and we walked back. I felt so proud that my grandfather defended me in that and took the action of actually walking to the store with me. He was rather stern in his attitude. Unfortunately, I think he did not get along very well with my father. For some reason, there was some degree of hardness between them. My grandfather used to say that he couldn't get anything out of my father. It was like pulling hen's teeth. They didn't have any long conversations together. They certainly respected each other, but they weren't very close. They weren't very close, and I felt rather sorry about that.
I can take a little. All right. Talking about how you're.
No, the 8 or 9 houses in that little area, which was shaped kind of like a horseshoe. Our house was the only house that had a telephone. And we were the only family that had cars. We had 2 cars. My grandfather had a car, of which he was very proud. It was the great possession of his life. And my father had a car. And we had a 2-car garage. No one else had a car, and no one else had a telephone. The result is that very often neighbors would come and use my grandfather's telephone. They'd usually leave a nickel behind for the use of the telephone. And they'd also stop and have conversations. Now, it's interesting that both my grandfather and my grandmother were more or less leaders of the little community. As I said, they never went out to anyone else's house, but people always came to them, consulted them, and so on. My grandmother had frequent ladies who visited her in the morning, and they'd have coffee, and I could tell they were pouring out their household problems, their marital problems to her, and she would kind of give advice. She was known as that kind of a woman, and so was my grandfather. People would come and ask him advice and so on, but otherwise he was quite aloof. He was a hatter who worked for the Mallory Hat Company, which was the big hat company in Danbury, which was the hat center of the country at that time. And he was what was known as a finisher. That was the best job in the hatting industry. And he worked up on the top floor of what was then, for Danbury, almost a skyscraper. It was a multi-storied building of maybe 6 or 7 stories. And it was the only building in Danbury which had an elevator. If you can imagine, we're talking now about the 1925, 1927 and thereabouts. And sometimes I would bring lunch to my grandfather, and I would like to do it because I'd ride on the elevator. It was the only chance I had to ride in an elevator. I didn't do that every day, but I did it maybe once a week. Now the finisher was the most highly paid of the hatters, and also it was the cleanest place to work, because they got the final hat and put the hat on a block, and the block rotated, and they had to apply a wax finish to the hat, and they had to shape the brim. If it was going to be a Homburg, for example, that brim had to be curled, and it was up to the finisher to curl the brim and to finish the hat. And then it went on to the ladies who worked on another floor, who sewed in the leather band and the silk lining and the silk band on the outside. So that was the finisher part. So they were quite well paid as pays went. The interesting thing is that working almost alongside my paternal grandfather was my maternal grandfather, who was also a finisher and worked in the same room. They didn't know each other, of course, before my mother and father were married. But it's interesting that both of my grandfathers had the same occupation, were working side by side, just as in the case of my grandchildren, Michael and Kenneth. Their paternal grandfather also, both of their grandfathers were James B. Duke professors at Duke University. So that's an interesting kind of coincidence that both of their grandfathers had similar jobs, and both of my grandfathers had similar jobs. My grandfather usually walked to work every day. I never knew him to miss a day of work. He always wore a coat and tie. When he went to work, changed his clothes, changed back. When he came home, he had virtually no amusements or no recreation. There was no such thing as taking a vacation in those days for workers. There was just no such thing. But his one recreation was on Saturday, which was a day off. He'd go to the movies, usually, and watch a cowboy and Indian movie. He loved cowboy and Indian movies. He'd go to the movies, and he'd go to Cut Bill's bakery shop and buy some chocolate eclairs and cream puffs and bring them back in the white box. He'd call me down because we lived upstairs, and I'll describe that in a moment, and he'd give me half an eclair or half a cream puff, and we would all enjoy those pastries on Saturday. We lived upstairs in this house of my grandfather's. The downstairs where my grandfather lived was heated by steam heat, but we had no heat upstairs. All we had was the kitchen stove, which originally was coal burning and later converted to oil. The result is, in the winter, it was almost freezing in the other rooms, so we had a day bed, what we called a day bed, or a couch in the kitchen, and that's where I slept in the winter to keep warm. But sleeping in my bedroom, it was miserable. It was so cold. The house was a peculiar house in that regard. I think it was originally a one-family house. I'm not sure, but in any case, the upstairs really wasn't very suitable as a place to live. My first recollection as a child was when I was about 5 years old, when my sister was born. My sister was born 5 years after I was, and my recollection was hearing a squealing at night. And my father told me that was the stork was crying as the stork brought the baby. In reality, of course, it was my sister being born. Births in those days occurred in the home. I remember Dr. Mullins, who was the leading physician of the time, coming up the stairs with his case and the baby was born, and my father and I slept on the floor next to my mother's bed in her bedroom. All that night I slept with my father on the floor with my head underneath one of the pieces of furniture. That was the birth of my sister. The second memory I had, early memory, was when I was about 6 or so. My mother's mother, whom I loved, she was a wonderful woman, who often came to visit us, came, and she brought a coconut custard pie. And I loved coconut custard pie, and as I ate into the piece of coconut custard pie, a loose tooth came out and stuck in the custard pie, and everybody was astounded at that. The tooth was in the pie. I remember that when I was about 6 years old. We moved eventually from this house, which was quite unsatisfactory, and my mother didn't like it. It wasn't very pleasant for her having her mother-in-law living downstairs, especially since she came from a Polish background, and all the neighbors came from an Italian background. So we moved to another house, which I'll discuss in a moment. But the living in this house.
How did you wind up living together with your grandparents and parents in the same house? How was it that they...
Yes, I'm not quite sure how that happened, but so far as I can gather, kind of listening to conversations as a kid, was that my grandfather was not too anxious to have my father get married. In those days, it was customary to think of your son as going out to work and giving the money to the family to support the family. That was still the custom among the immigrants. And of course, my father betrayed that custom. He got married. His father didn't want him to get married. Well, there was this apartment upstairs, so that's where they lived. And I suppose a financial aspect came in. I don't know whether they paid rent or not. I think they paid rent, but I never heard any mention of that. But anyhow, my mother was very anxious to move, and to move into her own house, and have a heated, modern house with central heating and so on, because as I said, this upstairs apartment was not heated. I remember, for example, that there were still gas lamps on the wall, although there was no gas. It had been electrified. My first 2 or 3 years, there was no bathroom. We took our bath in a big tub, which was heated on the kitchen stove. There was what was called a chemical toilet, in which you sprinkle lye after every movement, and my father had to empty that in the outhouse, because we had an outhouse also, which was still there. So it wasn't a very pleasant kind of place to live. I remember when the sewer was put in, and as a little boy I was astounded by the great big steam shovels which came in, operated literally by steam and fed by coal. And those steam shovels came in and dug the great trenches and so on for the sewer pipes. And as a boy I used to stand there during the day and watch those steam shovels operate. I've never forgotten that experience of watching those enormous pieces of machinery with the steam coming out and digging the trenches for the sewer pipes. That I think covers pretty much the personality of my grandfather. We have only 2 pictures of him. One is the wedding picture of my mother, where he is shown there and in a very dignified way. The other is a picture of him and my grandmother as they were quite old and looked a little bit different. We have also a snapshot of them. He was a great patriot. Although he was of Italian ancestry, he had nothing to do with Italy. He did not associate with Italian people. He did not belong to the Amerigo Vespucci Lodge, which was the customary lodge for Italian immigrants. He read English language papers, but he also read the Italian paper. He was a great patriot in the sense that at every national holiday he put out a great big flag in front of the house, and he tried his best to be an American and to renounce, in a sense, his own his own cultural identity. Well, I don't mean to say that he renounced it, but let's say that he made every effort to be a good American and to observe all the customs of Americans. Most other immigrants, of course, belonged to their lodges. He belonged to the Moose Lodge, which was quite interesting, the Loyal Order of the Moose, which is like the Elks, and that was a very American kind of lodge. One of the things I used to do on Sunday when I went to church, my mother gave me 10 cents to put in the basket at church, and sometimes I skipped church. Instead of going to church, I made a roundabout route down to the main street of the town, and I bought the Italian paper for him for 5 cents, and I bought a bar of candy for myself for 5 cents, and then I pretended that I went to church. That was about the only extent of crime in my life. But I came back and I'd give him the newspaper for 5 cents, and oh, he so much appreciated that. And then he already eaten the bar of candy. So my mother would ask me what was the sermon, what did the priest say in the sermon, and I invented something. Tell her that I went to church, but actually I didn't. I didn't do that very often, but I did that maybe once a month or something like that when I got bored with church. So I spent a nickel for a bar of candy and a nickel for the newspaper for him. But I don't regret it because he appreciated it very much.
Do you know why that you said that your grandfather wanted to be American had little to do with his Italian ancestry? Did he have? What were his reasons when he initially left Italy, or why would he have the feeling that he really wanted to become American rather than?
That I don't know. I don't know why they left, since she was only 19 and he was 32, so that was a substantial age difference. But I never found out the reason. Unfortunately, I never interviewed him or never talked to him about this, so I have no idea. Of course, as we know, all the immigrants during that period left because conditions were so miserable at home. Poverty was terrible, although he was in a pretty good position.
Did he keep track with any family that was back in Italy,
no,
or was
he did not. My grandmother did. She corresponded with her family, and I remember when her mother died, the arrival by the postman of an envelope bordered in black. I had never seen that before. The envelope had a black border, and that was a letter telling her that her mother died. And I remember her opening the letter, and the letter sheet, the paper, was also bordered in black. And it told her mother had died, and she broke down and cried on the porch of the house. I remember that very well. So she kept contact. I don't think he kept contact, but I'm not absolutely certain of that. But I saw no evidence of his maintaining any contact.
He didn't travel back to
No.
Italy, or
No. Some of the immigrants did, but of course there was no airplane travel then. It was a case of going by ship. And there's also the chance of losing your job. I mean, jobs were very precarious in those days. You could be laid off and so on. The heading industry was quite, it was an up and down industry. You never quite knew whether you'd be working next week or not. So he never, neither one of them ever went back, and they rarely talked about it, actually. Their cuisine was, he made his own wine, and in the cellar of the house, which was really a cellar with a dirt floor, he had an enormous, at least enormous to me as a little child looking up at it, an enormous wine press. And I remember how fascinated I was to see him turn this great wheel, and the press would come down and press the grapes into juice. And he had about 5 barrels, great big barrels in the cellar, in which the wine fermented. And he drank his own wine. He always had wine at meals. He was never drunk in any way. He never drank any hard liquor. There's no such thing, or any beer. But he did drink his own wine at dinner. He always had a glass of wine. For dessert, there was always fruit and nuts on the table. I remember that. Fruits and nuts and chestnuts were always on the table. and then he had some wine.
So while you all lived together with your grandparents, was it family dinners every night, or how?
No. We lived quite separately. Quite separately. Sometimes not even, my parents weren't even in communication with my grandparents, who lived downstairs, you see. There was very little communication. As I say, there was not a kind of cordial relationship between my father and my grandfather. They certainly respected each other, as I said before, but they didn't appear to be very close. Maybe it was a language problem, because my father spoke only English. My grandfather spoke broken English and Italian. May have been that. I don't know. The other aspect of this was that my grandparents brought up one of my cousins, whose name was Eugene. And for some reason, Eugene lived with them. He was the son of my grandparents' daughter, Emily, who had 8 children. And the first child was Eugene, and Eugene was brought up by the grandparents and lived downstairs with them. Eugene was a rough kind of guy. I don't think he even went to high school. He was the kind of guy who, as soon as he was able, would buy a motorcycle. And he didn't buy a motorcycle, but he bought a kind of a hot rod, which was unusual in those days. And he was a rough sort of fellow. I never liked him. But anyhow, he was brought up by them. And eventually, to end the story of my grandparents, Eugene got the house. They bequeathed the house to him, not my father, who was the son. But Eugene, the grandson, got the house and married someone of Swedish ancestry who was quite beautiful, whose name was Brida, and made an arrangement whereby he bought another house using that money, and my grandparents were to live with them. Well, of course it didn't work out. You're not going to find a young wife who's going to live with her husband's grandparents in the same house. So that lasted only for a few months. In the meantime, my grandfather died in his daughter's house, and my grandmother went to a kind of what would now be called a rest home, living with a practical nurse who took care of her, and she died in that way. But whatever money they had from the house went to this grandson, Eugene, who turned out to be kind of a culprit, and he himself died at an early age. So, as I say, my father had nothing to do with getting anything from his parents. Now, to move from my paternal, I should also add that these grandparents never went to church. In fact, they used to talk against the church and against religion. Though, like all Italians, of course, they were baptized in the church and they were buried in the church. But like most Italians, they just didn't go to church. My maternal grandparents were quite different. My maternal grandmother, whom I liked very much, but she died at an early age, and I remember now her body in the coffin, and I remember my mother and her sisters selecting a dress that she would wear, and it turned out to be a silk lavender dress with a lace collar. She died of a hysterectomy operation, which went bad. That left my grandfather, my mother's father, a widower at a very early age, and he never remarried. Now, he was a different sort of man. He, as I say, was also a hatter. He worked also for the Mallory Hat Company as a finisher with my other grandfather. But he was the kind of man who saved all of his money. He owned an apartment house that had 6 apartments in it. He bought a beautiful Victorian house next door to him, which had 4 apartments. He collected those rents. He lent out money for mortgages and charged interest, though not an exorbitant interest. So he was interested in accumulating money. He dressed very simply. The apartment he had for himself was a very simple kind of apartment. He was the kind of man who saved all his money. As a result, when he died, even though he had the several daughters, he was able to leave quite a bit of money to my mother and to her sisters. The one obsession he had was educating his son. He had one son, Edward, and Edward wanted to be a dentist. And he sent Edward to a private school instead of a public high school. I don't know why he did that. The public high school was very good. And eventually to dental college at the University of Maryland, and Edward became a dentist, a very good and well-known dentist in the city. My maternal grandfather, who came from Poland, was devoted to the church and to religion, as most Polish people were. And he was a leader in founding a church, the Sacred Heart Church, in Danbury. And you'll find in that church today a stained glass window with his name on it. He gave the stained glass window to the church. And he was a leader in the church. And I remember as a child, there was some difficulty about the priest who was in charge of the church. His name was Father Gwynn. The rumor was that Father Gwynn had been going out with women, of course, which you could not do as a celibate Catholic priest. And I remember the bishop coming to Danbury and coming to my grandfather's apartment and conferring with my grandfather as to what to do about this priest. I don't know what they said, but eventually the priest was defrocked, and he married this woman, and he lived someplace in town and had some kind of other secular work. But the point I'm making is that my grandfather was a leader in the church. There's no doubt of that. People looked up to him. Every Sunday he walked about 4 miles to church and attended Mass religiously. His recreation, he didn't have a car. He was kind of miserly in a way. He did not have a car. His one recreation was on Saturday night with his brother. He would walk to the pub. There was a Polish pub down in the center of Danbury, of the town of Danbury, and he'd have a couple of beers and come back, and that was his sole recreation. He didn't drink beer during the day, during the week. He didn't have any beer in the house, but he loved his 2 mugs of beer every Saturday night, and then he'd come back. That was his enjoyment. He didn't even go to the movies. He came of peasant stock. He was not of the educated class that my other grandparents were. I don't think he could read. I'm not certain of that, because he did make out checks. He was constantly showing us the checks that he made out to pay for his son's education. So he certainly knew enough to have a checking account and to sign checks. But I never saw him read. I never saw a newspaper or a book in his apartment. So I'm assuming he did not read. But again, I can't be certain of that. But he certainly was a different kind of personality from my other grandfather. There's no question about it. He did not have any great hobbies like gardening or winemaking as my other grandfather did. But he was a very good man and a very hard-working man. And again, I remember his going in coat and tie every morning, walking to work and walking back, year after year after year, with no vacation. Just this steady work for the Mallory Hat Company, finishing hats. Eventually, when he died, those 2 houses were sold, and the money was divided among his children, who were my mother and 3 sisters. So that was a different kind of setup, and he died under very good circumstances. He lived in his apartment, but he had given the house next door, the beautiful Victorian house, to one daughter, Loretta, so that she, in a sense, took care of him. He'd go over to the house, which is a short distance away, it was right next door, to have his meals and so on. All the sisters would get together and go to his apartment once a week and clean it up and do his laundry. So he died under the very best circumstances. He died suddenly of a heart attack, and he didn't die under the rather unfortunate circumstances of my other grandparents. So much for both sets of grandparents. Do you have any questions you want to ask me about them or about the times and the...
I'm curious about your mother's mother. I guess I heard some about your maternal grandfather, but what was your mother's mother like?
She, as I say, died at a very early age of a hysterectomy. We have a picture of her, which is in our albums, a wedding picture. She was quite a handsome woman, and so far as I can tell, she was greatly loved by her children. She walked the long distance very often to visit us when we lived in our grandfather's house. She came to visit us, but I don't remember much about her, except that I liked her, and my mother loved her, of course. But she died at that early age.
While you were still fairly young?
Yes, she died, I think, when I was about 6. And so she died leaving her daughters without a mother. So that was a rather difficult kind of situation.
So did you see both sets of, I guess there was a period of time where you lived with your paternal grandparents and parents up in the upstairs apartment, and then how far away did the maternal grandparents live? Could you walk to their house in Danbury, or how
yes, you
would
could
you
walk.
visit them?
It would be about 3 or 4 miles. It was an entirely different section. The interesting thing was that my maternal grandfather, who lived in his apartment house, this apartment house which he bought was a very shabby, ugly kind of house, architecturally speaking. It was not at all attractive. But strangely enough, it was in a neighborhood with very elegant houses, very elegant. And the house he bought next door was a beautiful Victorian house, an architectural gem. But his own house was miserable. It was terrible. It was the worst house in the area, there's no doubt. It was on a street called Orchard Street, surrounded by very elegant houses, not occupied by immigrants necessarily, but by people who've been in this country for some time. It was a very nice part of town. Whereas my paternal grandfather's house was the best house in the area, without any question. But my other grandfather's house was the worst house in the area. That the interesting contrast. And my maternal grandfather, he was not inclined, he didn't have any sense of taste or design or elegance. He didn't care. He just didn't care about it. It was a place to live, and that was all right. I used to paint the porch floors. That was my standard job. He gave me $5 to paint the porch floors. He had extensive porches around the house, and I do that every 2 or 3 years. It was a big job for $5. And I would wash the kitchen floor and wax it for $1. He'd give me $1 to do that. And I would do that every 2 weeks or so. And then he allowed me to bring back any bottles. He had some Coca-Cola bottles, soda bottles as he called them. He drank soda water. So there always accumulated a few soda water bottles in the cellar. And I would take those soda water bottles and get a refund of 1 cent, 1 cent per bottle. And then I'd get maybe 5 cents, there'd be 5 or 6 bottles, and I'd buy some candy on Saturday.
Did the grandparents, maternal and paternal grandparents, ever socialize with each other? Or
No,
was it...
no, they did not. That's interesting. I'm sure they never visited each other's house. Never. They came from 2 totally different cultures, and the only time they met was during the wedding, really, during the wedding of my parents. They were not antagonistic in any way, no. But their circles of friends were entirely different, and they did live some distance apart, so no, they did not associate.
What was it like in terms of how you got around? I guess you said that you all had a couple of automobiles, and not many people had automobiles. But did you walk into town most of the time, or were you driven around, or were there horses around, or how well, exactly did you?
I'm glad you asked that question. First of all, let me circumvent the question a bit and zero in on it. We have to remember that during that period, you had all kinds of services visiting the house. Most of it was horse-drawn. First of all, you had the iceman who came every day. The ice was drawn by horses. That was a great occasion for us children because we'd hang on the back of the ice wagon and get the chips of ice that had chipped off from when the iceman broke it up, and we'd suck that ice during the summer, and that was a great pleasure. That was drawn by 2 horses. Then we had the egg and cheese man. In our case, it was a woman who would come once a week to deliver eggs and cheese in a horse-drawn wagon. Then we'd have the rag man who came in a horse-drawn wagon, who collected rags, old rags, and sharpened knives and fixed umbrellas. He came about once a month. Then we had the baker who would come with all the baked goods, bread and so on. Then we had the vegetable and fruit man. He'd come in an old Ford truck to deliver the fruits and vegetables. And then, of course, we had an insurance man who came once a week to collect on your insurance policy. And we paid 10 cents or 15 cents for the insurance in that way, since there was no checking system then. So we had any number of vendors who would call at the house. Now, as for the transportation, to come directly to your question, my grandfather learned to drive when he was 60 years old, so he never quite mastered the coordination necessary in a shift car, in a gear where you shift the gears, the coordination necessary with the clutch, the accelerator, and the brake, and the gear shift lever. And it was a 4-cylinder Chevrolet. He loved it because it was a Landau Chevrolet, which was kind of the Impala of the time. It was the highest class Chevrolet there was, and he loved it. He polished it constantly. He wouldn't take it out in the rain because it'd get wet, and so on. So that was his pride and joy, was that car. But we lived in a valley, and there was a hill called Highland Avenue, which you had to go up. And that Highland Avenue hill went like this, and another road went like this. And if you had to stop here on the incline in order to see if there was traffic on the road. He never quite mastered he never quite mastered that. And he would get angry if you called his attention to it. But he'd get up that far, and then the car would stall, and he'd have to back all the way down and go up again. And sometimes it would take 2 or 3 tries for him to make that hill and to coordinate the clutch and the brake and so on. Poor man. So my grandmother never rode with him. She was afraid to drive with him. I drove with him occasionally. And yes, he used the car sometimes to go to work. But if it was raining, he'd rather walk in the rain than go in the car. And he would make, I think he used it on Saturday to go to the Wild West movie and to pick up his pastry. I think he used the car. But otherwise he walked. My grandmother, as I said, hardly ever left the house.
And would your father ever drive the car? Or?
Yes, my father drove, of course, his own car. My father had a great big Nash, which was an enormous car, and he would drive the car to work. And ultimately, we had 2 cars when we moved to another house, and he used a small Ford to drive to work and kept the Nash in the garage. Now, I can move on to our moving into another house. My mother was very desirous of moving, there's no question about it. Now, I was about 8 or 9 years old. Used to walk to school, and on my way to school I noticed they were building a house. And I used to hear my mother say, "Oh, if only I could have my own house." So I stopped at that house which they were building, though I was only a young boy. And I asked the builder how much it cost. He said $6,000 for the house. And I went back to my mother and I said, "Mom, there's a house being built up on Davis Street, and it cost $6,000. Now, Davis Street was a very good street. It was up on the top. We had lived in a valley. Davis Street was up on the top of the hill, and it had lovely houses. Some rather important people lived there. The first selectman, in New England we call the first selectman is the manager of the town, so to speak. So the first selectman lived across the street. Next door lived the leading dealer in batteries for cars. Next door lived an insurance man who had an important insurance company. Next door to him lived the tax collector, Mr. Carey, who was so rather important people lived on the street. And this house was rather nice on a corner. Well, my father and mother negotiated and they bought the house. They rented it for a year to help pay the mortgage, and I used to go up every day and water the lawn, and water the new hedges which had been planted. And then after a year they moved into the house themselves, and that house was a good house with central heating and so on. And it was in a very good neighborhood. So
how old were you when you moved into that house?
I think I was about 8 or 9.
That would have been 1928 or 29, somewhere around there.
Now at the beginning there was a trolley car, a trolley track that ran on Davis Street. We could take the trolley. But of course then most trolleys were eliminated, the tracks were taken up and they were replaced by buses. So our house on Davis Street was right on the bus line. In fact, the bus stopped just a few feet from our front door. It was a bus stop for the bus. So that was very convenient, but my mother hardly ever used it. She waited until she went out with my father in the car. Now my father, the thing I remember about my father, I also remember about my grandfather. Work, constant work, stability, and a great sense of responsibility. He also worked as a hatter in the same Mallory hat factory, but he worked in what was called the back shop, which was not as good a job as my grandfather had. The back shop was very difficult work, where you worked with a rubber apron and rubber boots, and you handled hats in steam and boiling water as they came out of a machine, and were sized down to a size. He was called a sizer. I know that because I tried this job myself. So these poor men worked. It would never be tolerated under current circumstances of OSHA, the Office of Safety and Health Administration. You worked with these hats coming out on a conveyor belt, and you had to stand there, dip your hands in cold water, and then handle the hats and throw them off in another direction, and they'd come off. You couldn't stop for a minute because all of the machines were operated centrally by a belted power system, and all the machines were working on the same power. So there was no such thing as stopping one machine. You had to keep up with this for 8 hours a day with half an hour off for lunch. I don't know how he did it as I look back on it. But anyhow, that was his job. Then for a while, the hatting industry was in bad shape. There was a strike, and he worked on the highway, helping build highways. I did that kind of work for about a year. But he was always working. He never had a vacation. Ultimately, after a few years, he became the superintendent of a big hat factory, which is again a terrible responsibility. Because he was even working when he was at home on the telephone, negotiating for this labor and that labor. Ultimately, then he owned his own hat factory called the Eagle Hat Company in Bethel, Connecticut, a small hat company which he owned with 2 other partners, but he managed the whole thing. And I worked there in the summers. I had the most miserable job available in the factory, but I worked there. I made about $15 a week. Ultimately, my grandfather worked there. He fired the boiler. In hatting, you had to have steam. Everything was steam. It depended on steam. And so you had to have a boiler which kept up with the steam. And I was embarrassed because my poor grandfather was too old really to be shoveling in coal into this furnace to make steam. And yet, sometimes there wasn't enough steam. And the men would complain, "We need steam." My poor father would have to go to my grandfather and say, "We don't have enough steam," and my poor grandfather he just couldn't keep up. But my father employed him anyhow just to give him a job, and eventually got another man in to help shovel in the coal and so on to keep up the steam. Um, that hat business failed, actually, and so he got a job. I saw, interestingly enough, saw an advertisement in the paper because I sensed what was going on, and I saw an advertisement in the paper that there was a hat factory in Canada where they wanted a superintendent in Guelph, Ontario. And unbeknownst to my father, I wrote a letter to the hat factory in Guelph, Ontario, and stated my father's qualifications. I signed a letter myself, and we got a telephone call that they were interested. My father went to Canada, and he got the job as superintendent of a hat factory in Guelph, Ontario, Canada. I had just completed high school. I was in my last year of high school when this happened. Well, my father came back from Canada. He said, "Canada's the country of the future. This is a wonderful place. Let's all move to Canada." My mother resisted, and I wondered where would I go to college in Canada. I began sending for catalogs of colleges in Canada, and we went to Canada for one summer, and we lived in Guelph, Ontario, in a hotel called the King Edward Hotel, which is still there. Not a very nice hotel, but it was the best hotel in the city. My father enjoyed the job, and he enjoyed the Canadians. My mother, of course, was isolated, just in the hotel with me and my sister, nothing to do. We went to movies, and that's about all. She made a few friends, but she was not a woman who could make friends easily. Her only friends really were her sisters, and she really didn't have any friends outside of the family. And she was a wonderful woman, but she didn't make friends easily. So we didn't like that Canadian venture. We came back, and then my father got a job as superintendent of a big hat factory in Norwalk, Connecticut, called the Norwalk Hat Company, which he had for the rest of his life. So he was superintendent of these big factories, but toward the end of his life it became extremely difficult because the old hatters were dying off, and the new hatters came in from New York into Connecticut, and they were unreliable. They were drunk on Monday, they were drunk over the weekend, and they didn't appear on Monday, and so on. He had a terrible job keeping the factory running, and eventually hatting died out completely in Danbury. All the hat factories closed. So he died just in time. There are now no hat factories at all in Danbury. Now, my father's life was terribly marred by the fact that he was sick most of his life. He had ulcers, and in those days they didn't know how to treat ulcers. Nowadays you just get an antibiotic and the ulcer disappears like that. In those days they treated it by diet, and so the only thing he could have was milk and graham crackers, so that he often had for his meal graham cracker mush, couldn't eat any meat, some vegetables but not all, and Jell-O. He had a lot of Jell-O and a lot of yogurt and things of that kind for his ulcers. And he suffered that way most of his life. Then for about the last 10 years he had cancer, and he died slowly of what was Hodgkin's disease, which in those days was not curable, but he had X-ray, radium treatments and so on, and surgery, which took out a cancerous ball, the doctor said, about the size of a grapefruit from his throat, and he weakened slowly and died slowly, and eventually he died in a good way. He died of a heart attack while he was being examined by his doctor. He had to go to Yale for his treatments, and he went to Yale for treatments once a week. Eventually they gave him blood transfusions, and he'd be good for a few days after each transfusion. Then he'd get so weak he couldn't walk up the stairs. So on one of his visits to the doctor at Yale, he died in the doctor's arms. I still have the letter from the doctor addressed to me telling how he died and how it was a good death. He died while we were examining him and so on. So that was the end of him. My mother then lived alone. She did very well indeed, living alone. And eventually, as she got older, my sister insisted that she come and live with her. So she sold the house. She She went to live with my sister in Ohio in a very small house. My sister was a widow at that time, and it was an impossible situation. They just didn't get along. So my mother would come here for a while, live with us, but my mother was not an easy woman to live with. She was quite demanding, and she was very fussy and so on. She just wasn't very easy to live with. So anyhow, she died in Ohio, in a rest home, where she had gone to live with my sister. No, let's see, what other...
How old were you when your father died?
Of course, I could look it up, but I was... when my father died, it was...
Were you in... You were in college, or were
No,
you...
I had gotten my PhD. I was teaching at Duke, yes. I was teaching at Duke, so it was after 1953. So I was...
Okay.
My children were born and so on. And I was on my way to Pakistan, interestingly enough. I went to Pakistan quite often in those days. I was on my way to Pakistan as a consultant in Karachi, and I got news of his death. I didn't want to cancel the appointment in Pakistan because they paid me quite well and I needed the money. So I flew to Danbury for my father's funeral. I was there for 3 days. I made all the arrangements. I did everything. I even gave the undertaker one of my neckties for my father to be buried in. I went from one office to another, Veterans Affairs, insurance company. I made all the arrangements for my mother. And after 3 days of that, working almost night and day, taking care of his funeral, I flew to New York and flew to Pakistan, to Karachi. When I arrived, I was practically a zombie. In those days, it was a propeller plane, by the way, though it took a long time to get there. Not jet. I arrived like a zombie, I think. I don't know what I did or what I said, but anyhow, I acted as a consultant and I came back. But I was totally worn out by the whole process. And I felt very remorseful that I had to leave and couldn't stay longer with my mother. But anyhow, I made all the arrangements, and I still have in writing now all the arrangements that I made for her. All the financial arrangements, how she was to be taken care of and so on, which I have here in the file. What other questions now do you have before?
So...
I think I've covered my grandparents pretty well. That was the important point, because I wanted you to know something about my grandparents, since you'd have no other way of knowing about them.
Yeah, that's good. This tape, it appears as though it's probably going to run out here in the next 5 minutes or something.
My mother's grandfather and I also got along very well. Very often I'd go and stay with him for 2 or 3 days in his apartment. And we got along very well indeed. He was a very good man and a very friendly man, but it's just that his personality was one of saving his money, making money and saving it, and eventually it was to my mother's advantage. My paternal grandfather lived rather elegantly. His house was beautifully furnished, wonderful furniture, a piano.
Were the streets out in front of the house paved, or were they?
No, in front of my grandfather's house there was a beautiful lawn with a picket fence. Oh, were the streets paved? No, the streets were not paved.
Was it a gravel or a dirt
It was
street?
gravel, just dirt.
It was dirt.
Eventually it was paved, but when I was a small boy growing up, it was dirt. As I say, I remember the steam shovel digging up the dirt. The other house that we moved into up on the hill on Davis Street, that was paved because they had recently taken up the trolley tracks which were there. And naturally, taking up the trolley tracks, they had to repave the street. So that was paved, and as I say, there was a bus service. And we were right across the street from the school, which I attended, the elementary school. Now, my school life was rather interesting. I was kind of always a teacher's pet because I was well behaved. I always came nicely dressed with my hair combed and so on. Some of the other kids were kind of a ruffian type, as we called them. And so I was very often a target of bullies. I can appreciate this business of bulliness. When I was in elementary school, there was one bully in particular. His name was Vinny Vigna. I've never forgotten his name, and he was a very rough. He rarely took a bath, rarely washed. His hair was all messed up, but he was tough and a tough fighter, and somehow he zeroed in on me. And every time I'd go out in the play yard, he'd look for me, and he'd just start fighting with his fists. His fists were all chapped and so on. And I was no fighter, as I said. I was not a ruffian. I was a very gentle, as I say, teacher's pet kind of boy, so he'd always win. And I was afraid of him. He just knocked me down on the ground and so on. Vinny Vigna. And until the teacher would come out and stop him. The teacher had a stick, and she had to hit him with a stick to make him stop. But in every grade I was, all the teachers, they considered me, they liked me very much, let me put it that way. Then I had two other bullies who bullied me. His name was Bobby Prince, and he lived in a house. And usually I had to pass that house to go to school. If he saw me pass, he'd come out and jump on me, just for no reason at all. These were real bullies in those days. They were ruffians, rough types, who didn't take a bath and so on. He'd start fighting me, and so I'd go another way and circumvent his house. I didn't want to pass the house where Bobby Prince lived. So Bobby Prince and Vinny Vigna were the two bullies and ruffians who got after me. And they say about these bullies, the thing to do is fight back. Well, somehow I never fought back. Even if I fought back, I'd lose, because I was never very athletically inclined, and I was never particularly strong. So I certainly couldn't win out in any such fights. But going into my own personal life is another matter. I don't want to cover that today. I simply want to cover the grandparents, the houses where we lived, the surroundings and so on. Once we got to Davis Street, my mother was quite happy. It was a very nice place to live, a very nice address, very good neighbors, and she was very happy with the house, although in fact the house was not well built.